When we use the term non-traditional, we're typically referring to the company, and the company could be Verizon or it could be a startup. It's a company that is a capability or is developing a capability, depending on who the customer is. They may want something that's already been demonstrated, or they may help develop it. It could be available across the entire commercial spectrum, but if it's never been used in government, they will take a look at it. And non-traditional refers to the portion of work that the company has that's federal. And it's typically, again, this will get down to Louisa, it's typically gets down to what percentage of work you have that is subject to the government unique rules, particularly around cost accounting. And I think it's 25% is the threshold or something like that. So when we say non-traditional, it can be any company that does not have a substantial piece of business with the federal government, other than maybe selling, shrink wrap commodities.
And to clarify, not every government customer has OT authority.
Correct.
Only 11, but DoD is in that bucket, and that is a pretty big customer.
And the reason that the DoD is exploding with this, it's gone from about $500 million in 2015 to, I think we'll hit $8 billion next year or close to it. So that's a pretty big jump. Just very quickly on other transactions, won't do a whole primer on them, but when they were created, they actually created back in the 50s when we created NASA, and then expanded in the late 80s, early 90s so that DoD could have access. And it was basically a research and development tool. It said, go out and find whatever capabilities are out there, write a contract. And it is legally a contract. It's not a federal contract, but it's legally a contract. Whatever terms it requires, just go do it. And it gave people great freedom. The problem was you could only use the authority for research and development. So if your company had another transaction and you were working with the Air Force and maybe or maybe not partnered with a large integrator, and you go through the development, you get to that final development process and prototype, and it's like, this really works. This is great stuff. And we want to go to manufacture it, produce, and implement it. Now you come back under the traditional federal acquisition regulation. So that was a real barrier to companies who were saying, well, why would I do that? I have no way to really realize the market value of what I'm developing. So there were relative modest usage of OTAs for many years. And I was personally involved in the late 90s trying to negotiate for authority to use the OTA for the life of the program. Whatever I'm buying under another transaction, for the life of that buy, using the same terms and conditions. And Congress finally did that a couple of years ago. And so now it's opened the floodgates, because I can now use another transaction. I'm going to say this a little bit loosely. It's not quite this loose. Almost as easily as I could use any other vehicle. Because if I qualify, I can come to you. You can go through the other transactions process, which is much streamlined over a regular procurement. You have purely commercial, negotiated commercial terms and conditions. And even once you're through development into production, we can stay on the same T's and C's. That is a huge shift, and that's really driving this.
You'd be amazed at how many government customers and users, stakeholders, program managers, acquisition folks are actually on LinkedIn and will actually respond more frequently to a LinkedIn message than to an email. I was told that maybe a year ago, and I didn't quite believe it until I actually started trying it myself. And so there are a lot of folks who are willing to have conversations. So as daunting as that may seem, trying to, quote unquote, cold call with LinkedIn messages to government folks is actually not a bad idea. It's boiling it down to who's buying what it is that you're providing, right? And you might be able to determine that by looking at the prime contractors who are on high profile vehicles with those customers. And once you've decided that those are specific customers you can target, then you can really drill down to, okay, who are the individuals that I need to be having conversations with? But there's, broadly speaking, there's the program office and the end customer, the end user and stakeholder. And then there's the other side, which is the acquisition shop. And depending on the program, those two groups may or may not see eye to eye. So another thing to note in the federal space is you have, while you're targeting a government customer, there are really multiple potential customers who you're speaking to and who you have to win over.
A couple of thoughts to that. One is the government is remarkably transparent if you know how to break through the transparency. In other words, the data is out there. Unfortunately, it often takes a degree of expertise. I don't know how to do it. I have people on my team who actually are good at this, who actually can extract information. Because one of the things about the government, every agency, and very often buying offices within agencies, have very different behavioral patterns. And what's really important for a smaller company, or any company really, to understand is what are the behaviors of different customers to see if you align. Are they very heavily small business focused? How do they think about the mid-tier? How do they think, you can get this from the data. So data analysis is one piece. The second thing that I think folks don't often recognize is almost every government opportunity, except those that are classified, is publicly available. Different sources, and requires a different amount of proactive work on behalf of the contractor. So for example, you have to register in the system, of course, to even be qualified, but do you track FedBizOps is what it's called, which is the website that has all of the major stuff. If you're thinking about other transactions, you need to be tracking not only Defense Innovation Unit, which actually has a feed that you can subscribe to. They post all of their needs statements as they come up, and anybody in the country, you don't have to be registered in SAM or anything. Anybody can respond to those that come up. But then there's 26 or 28, if you have what number of consortiums that are functionally focused for other transactions. So there's some around communications and technology, there's one for space and so forth. And depending on where your capabilities exist, you're going to want to take a hard look at those consortia to say, is it worth the money for me to join? Because within that consortia, those are the only folks who are going to see opportunities in that functional area. So they're all divided up, and they partner with the defense, typically the defense side, and the consortia provides a lot of support around contracting and so forth. So being proactive to get out there and suck up the information. And the final thing I was going to say is to be very discriminating about the opportunities you look at. It is, if you think about what Katie was talking about, just identifying sort of the navigational path to actual contract, it's a fair amount of effort. And so you don't want to be trying to do all things to all people. Target a couple of key places where you think you genuinely bring in a discriminator. If you're, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, if you're another IT services provider, look for a smaller agency that may have some problems that the big guys aren't looking at because their contracts aren't big enough. Maybe you can go make a real difference and use that as a jumping off point. Or to Katie's point, figure out who's working in the agencies you would like to work in and go figure out how to partner with them. Those are really the best ways into the market.
Another thing about resources, you have limited resources and bandwidth, so you're not going to chase every opportunity. If you've identified an opportunity that you want to pursue, the proposal writing process is intense, and it very well could cost you a lot of money from the compliance perspective, pricing, all that kind of stuff. So I would recommend, if you truly believe, you know what, I'm going to respond to this RFP, run it by someone else, run it by someone in the federal space. Because the one thing you want to kind of flesh out is, frankly, is this baked for someone else? Does the government customer have someone in mind that, frankly, they want to award this to? And if so, then it's not worth your time and resources to pursue that opportunity, as difficult as that may sound. So I think really shredding an RFP and maybe having a fresh set of eyes or someone who understands the federal space is important to making sure you don't waste a lot of money and time.
There was one question about, is there an organization that front doors the process for startups to help identify opportunities? Typically, there are in agencies small business offices, and they have ombudsmen. In some cases, they have advocates. I will honestly say to you, in this private chat that will never going to live forever, and I could never get rid of it, most of them are terrible. And I wouldn't rely on that path too much, although some agencies, DHS has a pretty good office where they do try hard to engage. Army has traditionally done relatively well. There are other centers around the country called Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, or PTACs, which do help very small businesses, typically on the more practical and technical side of things, around finance and rules and compliance and so forth. They can be helpful resources, not necessarily for identifying opportunities, but as Katie and I are both saying, it really requires that you get into to the federal BizOps to find out what's there, and then to follow the other entities, whether it's AFWorks and the Air Force, or DIU, or the various consortium, to figure out what it is. They will tell you what they're following. The final thing I'll say on that is, take the time, if you're looking at a specific agency, some agencies have very good forecasts and some have terrible forecasts, but some agencies do put out a pretty good document. If you're doing IT services and you want to support the U.S. Agency for International Development, which has a lot of IT, they have a really good forecast, and it tells you pretty much what they're going to be looking for the next year. It doesn't tell you timing or contracts, but it gives you a good strategic sense of where they're going.
I know we have AFWorks as mentioned multiple times in the chat box, but I'm a huge fan of AFWorks, and especially since COVID hit, they've done a great job in pivoting. Their virtual events are great, and they're fairly frequent. They do a great job of kind of laying out the problem sets. So I think Air Force with AFWorks has done a really good job. Naval X is relatively new, stood up, I guess, a year and a half ago, but they're another organization that on the Navy side, but they have, I think, a half dozen tech bridge centers across the country. One of them is in my backyard here in Alexandria, Virginia, but those are other great places to get plugged into to really find opportunities within DoD for non-traditionals.
And the last one I'll mention is the new Space Force. They formally will get acquisition authority in 2021. And they are pursuing, as a matter of strategy, a relatively non-traditional acquisitions approach. I mean, one of their big goals, given the nature of what they're going to be buying, is to be buying largely from the non-traditional community.